All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going deep into dermatopathology.
Skin diseases, right?
You got it. We've got this pathology textbook chapter, and let me tell you, it's fascinating stuff.
It is. And what's really cool is that we're talking about stuff that most people have dealt with at some point.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like, who hasn't had a freckle? But honestly, I never really thought about, what causes them.
And that's what makes this so interesting. We'll be uncovering all those hidden connections, all those things beneath the surface. Like, did you know those freckles can actually tell you how your skin reacts to the sun?
Really? Huh. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, so like freckles, those little dots that kind of pop up when you're a kid, they're from an increase in melanin, the stuff that gives your skin color. And when you're out in the sun, those melanin cells go into overdrive.
Ah, so that's why they fade in the winter when there's less sun. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about things like lentigos? Do those change with the sun too?
Nope, lentigos are different. They're brown spots too, but they come from having more melanocytes, the cells that make the pigment.
So it's more about the number of cells than the amount of pigment they're making.
Exactly. And speaking of pigment and these melanocytes, let's talk about vitiligo, those patches of skin that lose their color.
Yeah, I always thought of that as, just a loss of pigment.
It is, but it's also an immune system thing. The body actually attacks those melanocytes, causing those patches.
Wow, I had no idea. So it's not just a cosmetic thing. It could be a sign of something else going on.
Right. And get this, vitiligo often pops up in people who have other autoimmune conditions, things like Hashimoto's thyroiditis or type 1 diabetes.
Seriously, that's a connection I would never have made.
It really shows you how connected everything is.
You mentioned albinism earlier. How does that fit in here? Is that related to vitiligo?
Not really. Albinism is genetic. There's a problem with an enzyme called tyrosinase, which is needed to make melanin.
So instead of the immune system attacking the cells, they just can't make the pigment in the first place.
Right. And it affects the whole body, not just patches like vitiligo.
Okay, that makes sense. We've just scratched the surface here, but I'm already learning so much. What's next?
Let's move on to moles. Everyone has them, but they're not all the same.
Ah, moles. You mean those little brown spots?
Yep, we call them melanocytic nevi. They're just benign growths of those melanocytes.
Benign, meaning not cancerous, right?
Exactly. But the cool thing is how they can evolve over time.
Evolve. Like how?
It's mostly about where they are in the skin layers. There are three main types: junctional, compound, and intradermal. Junctional are just in the epidermis, the top layer. Compound ones have cells in both the epidermis and the dermis, that's the layer underneath. And then intradermal amidi are completely in the dermis.
So it's like they're moving deeper as they mature.
Exactly. And as they go deeper, they actually look different under a microscope.
Interesting. But I got to ask, when I think of moles, I always think about skin cancer.
I get it. And that brings us to dysplastic nevi. These are the ones that can become melanoma.
It's plastic.
Oh.
Sounds kind of scary.
They have irregular borders, different pigmentation. Think of it like a cookie. A normal mole is a perfect round cookie. A dysplastic one is like nibbled on with different colored sprinkles.
Okay, that makes sense. So oddly shaped, different colors, that's a red flag.
Definitely better safe than sorry.
All right, so melanoma. It's like the villain of the skin world, right?
Malignant melanoma is serious, and it's important to understand it. For instance, did you know there's actually more than one type?
Wait, really? I thought melanoma was like just melanoma? What are the different types?
Okay, so there's superficial spreading, that's the most common one. Then there's lentigo maligna, and then there's nodular melanoma, that one's more aggressive. And finally, acral lentiginous melanoma, that one usually shows up in places like the nail beds or palms.
Wow, I had no idea. So what causes all these different types? Is it all sun exposure?
Sun is a big factor, especially for people with fair skin. But what really happens is that the sun damages the DNA in those melanocytes. Like imagine their DNA gets scrambled.
Like typos in the genetic code.
Exactly. And some of those typos can mess with genes that control cell growth, like a gene called CDKN2A. That one's often messed up in melanoma.
So damaged DNA leads to out-of-control cells, potentially cancer. Got it. But what about when melanoma spreads? How does that happen?
It's all about how it grows. Remember those radial and vertical patterns?
Right, horizontal and downward.
Well, if it's growing radially, staying in the top layers, it's less likely to spread. But once it goes vertical, that's when it gets risky.
So once it breaks through to the deeper layer, it can travel to other parts of the body.
You got it. And that's why the depth of the melanoma, the Breslow depth, is so important.
So shallower is better news than deeper.
Exactly. And there are other risk factors too, like having a lot of those dysplastic nevi or giant nevi. Those are the really big ones, bigger than 20 centimeters.
So family history and keeping an eye on any weird-looking moles are important. What about warning signs? Like, what should people look out for?
Any changes in size, shape, or color are worth checking out. Like imagine drawing a line down the middle of a mole. If the two sides don't match up, that could be a problem.
So if it starts growing really fast or gets more asymmetrical.
Exactly. And watch for color changes too. Like if it develops different shades of brown, black, even red or blue, that's concerning.
Okay, so any weird changes, go see a dermatologist. What about diagnosing it? Are there tests they use?
Besides the exam, doctors often use tumor markers to diagnose and monitor melanoma. Think of them like little flags that indicate cancer.
So substances in the blood or tissue that can be detected.
Exactly. For melanoma, two common ones are S100 and HMB45.
Good to know. We've covered a lot with these melanocytic things, from freckles to melanoma. It's incredible how much variety there is.
It's been quite a journey, and we still got more to explore. Ready to move on from moles, there's a lot more to see.
Absolutely. What else have we got?
Okay, how about seborrheic keratosis? Ever heard of that?
Seborrheic keratosis. Rings a bell, but I'm not sure.
It's that thing where you get those brown spots that look kind of stuck on.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. Are they anything to worry about?
Nah, they're usually harmless. Under the microscope, you see all these basal-like cells, and the outer skin layer gets all thick. But here's something interesting. There's this thing called the sign of Lesser-Trillat.
Sign of what now?
Lesser-Trillat. It's when you suddenly get a bunch of these seborrheic keratoses. And sometimes it can mean there's an internal malignancy, like adenocarcinoma in the GI tract.
Wait, seriously? Those little stuck-on things could be a sign of something that serious.
It's a reminder that your skin can tell you a lot about what's going on inside.
That's incredible. It's like the skin is sending us secret messages.
Exactly. Now, how about acanthosis nigricans? You ever seen those patches of skin that get thick and dark, usually on the neck or armpits?
Acanthosis nigricans, yeah. I've heard of it, but I don't really know what causes it.
Well, there are two main types, benign and malignant. The benign kind is usually linked to insulin resistance.
Insulin resistance, that's a diabetes thing, right?
Right. It's like a prediabetes stage. And acanthosis nigricans can be an early warning sign.
So it's not just what the skin looks like. It's about what it might be telling you about your health.
Exactly. And in rarer cases, the malignant form can be a sign of cancer, usually in the GI tract again.
Wow, I'm seeing a pattern here. Skin changes can point to some pretty serious stuff.
They can. So, are you ready to dive into precancerous conditions and carcinomas?
Gulp. Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it.
Great. Let's start with actinic keratosis. Ever noticed a rough patch on your skin, maybe with a little horn sticking out?
Oh, yeah, I had something like that on my shoulder once. It felt like sandpaper. Is that what you're talking about?
Probably. That's actinic keratosis. And it's considered precancerous. It could turn into squamous cell carcinoma.
Precancerous, meaning it's not cancer yet, but it could become cancer.
Right. It's often caused by sun exposure, which damages the DNA in your skin cells.
So protecting yourself from the sun is super important, not just for wrinkles, but also for cancer.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about squamous cell carcinoma. That's the second most common skin cancer.
Squamous cell carcinoma. That sounds serious.
It is, but the good news is it rarely spreads. Only about 5% of cases.
Okay, that is good news. So what causes it? Too much sun again.
Sun is a big factor, especially for older folks. But things like chronic ulcers, burns, even infections in the bone can increase your risk.
So any kind of chronic irritation can be a problem.
Right. And did you know that multiple squamous cell carcinomas can pop up in places where you've been exposed to arsenic?
Arsenic, like the poison? Wow, I had no idea.
It's a reminder that even environmental stuff can affect your skin. Now, on to the most common type of skin cancer, basal cell carcinoma.
I think that's the one I hear about the most. Isn't that the kind that's usually easy to treat?
It is. It's very treatable, especially if you catch it early, and it rarely spreads. But like the others, sun exposure is a big risk factor. And you guessed it, gene mutations play a role too.
Okay, so genes and sun. Got it. Are there any other key things to know about basal cell carcinoma?
It often looks like a pearly little bump with tiny blood vessels underneath, almost like a pearl with a red halo.
That's a pretty distinct image. I'll keep an eye out for those.
And sometimes they can ulcerate, which is why they used to be called rodent ulcers.
Rodent ulcers. Yikes. That doesn't sound good.
Not the best name, I know. But luckily, with early detection and treatment, it's usually manageable.
Okay, that's good to know. So we've covered those 3 types of skin cancer. What's next?
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about inherited skin syndromes. This is where genetics really come into play.
Inherited skin syndromes. Sounds like we're getting into some serious stuff.
We are, but it's important to understand how our genes can make us more susceptible to certain conditions. Let's start with basal cell nevus syndrome. You might hear it called Gorlin syndrome too.
Gorlin syndrome. Didn't we talk about a gene called PTCH earlier with basal cell carcinoma?
You have a good memory. Basal cell nevus syndrome is caused by a mutation in that PTCH gene, and it's autosomal dominant.
Meaning there's a 50% chance of passing it on to your kids.
Yep. And people with this syndrome get multiple basal cell carcinomas at a really young age. We're talking before 20.
Wow, that's young to be dealing with skin cancer. Are there any other signs of this syndrome?
Besides the skin cancers, they often have dental problems and jaw cysts. They can also have these little indentations on their palms and soles. We call them pitting.
So it's not just skin, it affects other parts of the body too.
It does, which shows how one gene mutation can have widespread effects.
Okay, so basal cell nevus syndrome is linked to that PTCH gene and causes those multiple basal cell carcinomas. What other inherited syndromes are out there?
Let's talk about dysplastic nevus syndrome. Sometimes it's called familial melanoma syndrome. This one puts you at high risk for melanoma. And just like basal cell nevus syndrome, it's autosomal dominant.
So 50-50 chance of passing it on.
Right. And if you do inherit the gene, chances are you'll develop the condition. We call that high penetrance.
This is not just a possibility, it's almost a guarantee. That's scary.
It's definitely a serious condition, and family history is crucial here.
So what should people be looking for?
People with this syndrome usually have fair skin and tons of those irregular moles, those dysplastic nevi. They often have that mixed up coloration, different shades of brown and black.
Fair skin and a lot of weird looking moles. Got it.
Definitely something to get checked out by a dermatologist. Early detection is key, especially if melanoma runs in the family.
Okay.
So we've covered inherited syndromes. What's next?
Let's move on to acute inflammatory dermatosis. These are the conditions that come on suddenly and don't last long.
Acute inflammatory dermatosis, that's a mouthful.
It is, but they're basically just the skin's way of reacting quickly to something. Let's start with hives.
Hives, oh yeah, I know those. They are so itchy.
Right. Well, it all comes down to mast cells. They're part of the immune system, and they contain histamine.
Histamine, like the stuff that makes you sneeze when you have allergies.
The very same. When those mast cells are triggered, they release histamine, and that's what causes the redness and swelling of hives.
So it's like an overreaction to something. You got it. But not all hives are from allergies. There are 2 types, IgE dependent and IgE independent.
IgE, isn't that an antibody?
Right, immunoglobulin E. It's involved in allergic reactions. So the IgE-dependent hives are the allergic kind, like from pollen or food. But then there are the IgE-independent ones, where something directly activates the mast cells.
So you can get hives from things other than allergies.
Absolutely. Some medications, like certain antibiotics, can trigger them. Even physical things like cold or pressure can cause hives in some people.
I had no idea. Hives are more complicated than I thought. What else do we have in these acute inflammatory conditions?
Let's talk about acute eczematous dermatitis.
Eczema. Yeah, I know that one. It's that itchy red rash, right?
That's one way it can look, but eczema is kind of a broad term. In the acute phase, it might be red, oozing, even crusty.
So it can look different depending on what stage it's in.
Exactly. And there are a bunch of different types, each with their own trigger.
Of what? What are some examples?
Well, there's allergic contact dermatitis. That's like when you touch poison ivy. Then there's atopic dermatitis, the kind that people usually just call eczema. And we have drug-related eczematous dermatitis, photoeczematous dermatitis, and primary irritant dermatitis.
Wow, so many different types. Is there anything that ties them all together?
Well, the common thing is that the immune system is involved in all of them. It starts with an antigen. That's anything that triggers an immune response. Think of it as like a foreign invader.
So it sets off the alarms in the immune system.
Exactly. That antigen gets picked up by Langerhans cells in the skin, and they show it to T cells, which then release cytokines. Those are the chemical messengers that cause inflammation.
So it's like a chain reaction in the immune system.
Yep, and that's what ultimately leads to the redness, swelling, and itching of eczema.
Fascinating. The immune system is really complex. Okay, what's next?
How about erythema multiforme? That's one that often has those target lesions.
Target lesions. What are those?
Imagine a red spot with a pale center, like a bullseye.
Okay, I can picture that. What causes erythema multiforme?
It can be caused by infections like herpes simplex virus or reactions to medications like sulfonamides, penicillin, or salicylates.
So again, the immune system overreacting to something.
Right. And here's the thing, it can have some more serious forms like Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis.
Those sound pretty scary. What are they?
Stevens-Johnson syndrome is a more widespread form. It often affects kids and can involve fever and lesions in the mouth. There's even a risk of sepsis.
Sepsis, isn't that when an infection spreads through the blood?
Yes, very serious. And then toxic epidermal necrolysis is even worse. It involves the skin dying off.
Wow, that sounds awful.
It is. But luckily, those more serious forms are rare.
Okay, good to know. So we've talked about hives, eczema, and erythema multiforme. What's next?
Let's move on to chronic inflammatory dermatosis. Those are the conditions that tend to stick around longer.
Chronic inflammatory dermatosis, got it.
All right, let's start with a big one. Psoriasis. You know those red scaly patches?
Yeah, I've seen those. It's like they have silvery scales.
Exactly. Psoriasis affects about 1-2% of people in the US. And guess what plays a big role?
I'm going to guess genetics and the immune system.
Bingo. About 2/3 of people with psoriasis have this genetic marker, HLA-CW0602.
Another one of those immune system genes, right?
Right. And in psoriasis, the immune system basically attacks the body's own skin cells.
So it's an autoimmune condition, like vitiligo.
Exactly. And that's what causes those red, scaly patches.
What else should people look out for if they think they might have psoriasis?
Well, besides those red patches with scales, there's something called the Auspitz sign. If you peel off a scale, it'll bleed a little.
Ouch.
Yeah, not fun. Psoriasis can also mess with your nails, make them discolored and pitted. And there's this related condition, psoriatic arthritis.
Psoriatic arthritis, that sounds painful.
It is. It's a type of arthritis that affects the joints, and it can cause pain, stiffness, and swelling.
So not only do you have the skin problems, but you could also get joint issues.
Right, which is why it's so important to manage psoriasis well. Now let's talk about seborrheic dermatitis.
Seborrheic dermatitis. That sounds familiar.
Think dandruff or cradle cap.
Wait a minute, are you saying dandruff and cradle cap are the same thing?
They are. They're both forms of seborrheic dermatitis.
Wow, mind blown. I never knew that.
Right. It's amazing how one condition can look so different depending on where it is and how old you are.
So what causes it? Is it the immune system again?
We don't know for sure, but it seems to be linked to an overgrowth of this yeast called Malassezia furfur. It usually lives on our skin harmlessly, but sometimes it gets out of control.
A yeast, like the stuff we use to make bread.
Yep, that's the one. And when it overgrows, it triggers inflammation and those greasy, scaly patches.
So dandruff is basically seborrheic dermatitis on the scalp, and cradle cap is the same thing, but on a baby scalp.
Right.
What's next?
Let's move on to blistering diseases. These are conditions where the skin, blisters.
Blistering disease, it doesn't sound fun.
They can be pretty uncomfortable. The key feature here is acantholysis, which means a loss of cell adhesion.
Acantholysis. So the cells that are supposed to stick together start coming apart.
Yep, and that's what causes those blisters. There are 3 main ones we'll talk about: pemphigus, bullous pemphigoid, and dermatitis herpetiformis.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. What's pemphigus?
Pemphigus is actually a group of autoimmune blistering diseases that can affect the skin and the mucous membranes.
Mucous membranes, like inside the mouth.
Right, and the nose, eyes, and genitals too.
So you could get blisters inside your mouth.
You can. That's actually common in pemphigus vulgaris, the most common type. In this one, your body makes antibodies against a protein called desmoglein 3, which helps hold skin cells together.
So it's like your immune system is attacking the glue that holds your skin together.
That's a great way to think about it. And these blisters tend to pop easily, which can be painful.
Ouch, that sounds rough. Anything else that makes pemphigus vulgaris stand out?
One thing is the Nikolsky sign. You can test for it by gently pressing on the skin. If it's loose off, that's a positive sign.
Wow, that's crazy. So pemphigus vulgaris is those fragile blisters, often in the mouth, and that positive Nikolsky sign. What about bullous pemphigoid? How is that different?
Bullous pemphigoid is autoimmune too, but it usually affects older adults. And in this one, the antibodies target a different protein called hemidesmosomes. That one anchors the skin cells to the basement membrane.
The basement membrane, that's like the foundation of the skin, right?
Exactly. So the blisters in bullous pemphigoid form deeper down, and they're tense and don't break as easily as the ones in pemphigus.
So different target, different level, different type of blister. And I'm guessing the Nikolsky sign is negative in bullous pemphigoid.
You got it. The skin won't slough off as easily.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about that third one? Dermatitis herpetiformis.
Dermatitis herpetiformis. That one's interesting because it's linked to celiac disease.
Celiac disease, the gluten intolerance thing.
Yep, that's the one. We basically think of dermatitis herpetiformis as a skin symptom of celiac disease.
Wow, so you can have skin symptoms from a digestive disorder.
It's a reminder that everything in the body is connected. And it shows how what you eat can affect your skin too.
So what are the skin symptoms? More blisters.
Yes, but these are super itchy blisters. They usually show up on places like elbows, knees, buttocks.
Super itchy. That sounds terrible.
It can be. And once again, it all comes down to the immune system.
I think I'm getting the hang of this. So what's the immune system attacking this time?
Gliadin, which is a component of gluten and reticulin, a protein found in connective tissue.
So it's like a misguided attack on gluten and connective tissue.
That's a good way to put it. And here's the cool part. If someone with this condition goes gluten-free, their skin often gets way better.
Wow, so changing your diet can actually treat a skin condition. That's incredible.
It really shows how much lifestyle can influence skin health. Our skin isn't just a covering, it's part of our whole system.
I'm really starting to see that. Dermatopathology is like detective work.
It is. And we've still got more to explore. It's amazing how many things can affect the skin, isn't it?
It really is. But I'm ready for more. What else is there?
Okay, let's talk about how skin problems can be a sign of something bigger going on in the body, like a warning sign.
So something that looks like a skin issue could actually be a clue to a whole body problem. That's kind of scary, but also really interesting.
It is. Your skin is the outer layer, right? So it's often the first place you see signs of trouble. Let's talk about necrobiosis lipoidica.
Necrobiosis lipoidica. That sounds serious.
It's not life-threatening, but it's often linked to diabetes.
Diabetes, the blood sugar thing.
Yep. With necrobiosis lipoidica, you usually get these yellowish-brown patches, usually on the shins. People sometimes mistake them for other things, but if you see them, it's a good idea to check for diabetes.
So it's like it's a subtle hint that something might be off with how the body's using sugar.
Exactly. Now let's talk about pyoderma gangrenosum.
Pyoderma gangrenosum. Okay, that one sounds intimidating.
It can be a tough one. It's often linked to inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis.
Ulcerative colitis, that's the inflammation of the colon, right?
Right, with pyoderma gangrenosum, you get these nasty ulcers, purple in the middle, red around the edges. They look really bad.
Oh, wow. So how do you know if it's that and not something else?
The tricky thing is, it can look a lot like cellulitis at first, which is a much more common skin infection.
So you could misdiagnose it.
It happens. And to make things worse, the ulcers don't respond to antibiotics, which is how you usually treat cellulitis.
So if it looks like cellulitis but doesn't get better with antibiotics, that's a red flag.
It could be, especially if the person has a history of inflammatory bowel disease. You really have to think about the whole picture.
Makes sense. So how do you treat it if it is pyoderma gangrenosum?
Often you need corticosteroids or other medications that suppress the immune system to get the inflammation under control.
Okay, so it's not a simple fix.
Not always. It shows how important it is to think about the whole body, not just the skin. Okay, ready for another one. This one's called ecthyma gangrenosum.
Ecthyma gangrenosum. Whoa, another intense sounding one. What makes this one so serious?
This one is a sign of sepsis, which is when an infection spreads throughout the body.
Sepsis, so like when an infection gets into the bloodstream.
Exactly. It's a really dangerous situation. And ecthyma gangrenosum is one way it can show up on the skin.
So what does it look like?
It usually starts with small pus-filled bumps, but they can quickly turn into blisters filled with blood.
Blood-filled blisters. That sounds awful.
It's not good. And then those blisters can turn into ulcers where the tissue actually starts to die. It's a bad sign.
So if you see that, you need to get help right away.
Absolutely. It's often caused by a bacteria called Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It can be really hard to treat.
Pseudomonas, that's the one that's resistant to a lot of antibiotics, right?
Unfortunately, yes. Okay, one more to go. Porphyria cutanea tarda. It's a chronic blistering condition.
Porphyria cutanea tarda. Okay, what's the story with that one?
It's caused by a deficiency in an enzyme, urocorpharinogen decarboxylase.
That's a long one. What does that enzyme do?
It helps make heme. Heme is part of hemoglobin, which is in red blood cells. Hemoglobin carries oxygen.
So without that enzyme, you can't make heme properly.
Right. And then these other chemicals, porphyrins, build up in the body, and that can cause problems, especially in the skin.
So what happens to the skin?
One of the big things is that you become really sensitive to sunlight. Like even a little bit of sun can cause blisters, especially on your hands and face.
So you'd have to be super careful about sun protection.
Definitely. And most cases are actually acquired, not genetic.
Acquired, so you're not born with it, you get it later.
Right. It's often linked to liver disease, things like alcohol abuse or hepatitis.
So it's a mix of genes and environment, like a lot of these conditions.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how the skin reflects what's happening inside the body.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredible. I never realized how complex and important our skin is.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's a fascinating field. Remember, your skin is always sending you messages, so pay attention to what it's saying. And if you're ever worried about something, don't hesitate to see a dermatologist.
That's great advice. Well, listeners, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world beneath the surface of our skin. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll join us again for our next exploration of the human body.